The prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideals, but laying aside all private interests and prejudices, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Please be seated.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 18, Utility Commodity Rebate Act. Honourable Mr. Nally.
I see the Honourable Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to rise to move a critically important piece of legislation to second reading. I'm referring to Bill 18, the Utility Commodity Rebate Act. We all know that Albertans have had a difficult time over the past 2 years. We've witnessed as much with our own eyes, and we've heard the stories from families, friends, and the constituents we represent. First, there was the pandemic, accompanied by massive economic hardship and a historic crash in energy prices. Now, driven by geopolitical uncertainty, supply chain disruptions, and a federal government intent on sending spending through the roof, families and businesses are dealing with the worst inflation in decades, which has led to higher prices for everything from food to fuel. For many Albertans, coping with steeper bills, the pressure on their wallet is becoming unbearable. Alberta's government has heard their calls for help, and we've moved quickly in response. First and foremost, Bill 18 will provide Albertans with some desperately needed fiscal relief. On March 17th, we announced electricity rebates to protect families, farmers, and businesses from the worst effects of skyrocketing energy prices. These rebates will provide $50 a month for 3 months to compensate for the higher cost of electricity experienced in January, February, and March. That amounts to $150 in critical assistance for nearly 2 million homes, farms, and small businesses, so that they can have some relief on their utility bills. The best part, this rebate doesn't need any complicated application process or confusing documents. We're working with retailers, so it will go directly onto their bills, saving Albertans time and money. Families shouldn't have to go into debt to cover their basic living expenses, or have to make the choice between putting food on the table or keeping their lights on. And small businesses struggling to recover from the worst effects of the pandemic shouldn't have to cope with even more burdens from energy inflation. Amid these challenging times, we are taking real action to make life a little bit easier for everyone. Our proposed legislation will create a mechanism that lets us roll those rebates out to Albertans swiftly and effectively. Through this bill, we are integrating utility commodities under a single legislative framework. The Natural Gas Price Protection Act does not allow for rebates on electricity. In the interests of efficiency, Bill 18 will replace the original Natural Gas Protection Act in order to implement both rebates under the same act. Under this new legislation, Alberta's government will have the tools to respond to these high prices we've been seeing and provide much needed relief to families and businesses. It's not just the right thing to do. Heat and electricity are essentials. They're key to getting through an Alberta winter, and they're an unavoidable cost for just about every small business. This legislation ensures that we can move quickly and effectively to support Albertans against high commodity prices. Alberta's economic recovery and Albertans' peace of mind demand nothing less. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been ready with emergency measures for difficult situations. And at this time of price uncertainty, that's not going to change. You can see that in other steps we've taken to make life more affordable for Albertans, like removing the provincial fuel tax at the pumps. Later this spring, we will be introducing legislation to enable unlimited self-supply of energy with the option to export, as well as energy storage. These new tools will help increase competition, add more supply, and bring down energy prices over time. Our government is also reviewing the province's distribution and transmission policies. And we're working with agencies and industry partners to maximize system efficiency, to make sure we're getting everything we can out of ratepayer dollars. Mr. Speaker, there is not a single conversation that I have about utilities that doesn't start and end with affordability. At a time when we have a federal government that is determined to hammer the pocketbooks of families, retirees, and students for just heating homes, and of course, a hangover from the ideologically driven policies of the NDP, this government is stepping up. Unfortunately, we were handed a broken system by the previous government thanks to their short-sighted approach to energy policy. They spent $7.5 billion on transmission. 7.5. We all know that new transmission is needed at times, and maintenance, of course, has to be done. But to spend such a massive amount when it was clear our economy couldn't support it, an absolute shame. Albertans will be footing the bill of that mistake for years. To give the members opposite some credit, they were not guilty of starting that overbuild, but they were absolutely guilty of not stopping it. They approved the build-out during the years they sat on this side of the House. They can't blame anyone but themselves for that, Mr. Speaker. When we came into office, we stopped it. And we are making sure that taxpayer and ratepayer dollars are treated with the respect they deserve. Fiscal responsibility is critically important when it comes to the electricity grid, and that's a quality that the previous government lacked on all fronts. Adding on to that $7.5 billion loss, their ideological agenda and dedication to their leftist extremist friends lost Albertans another $1.3 billion through the balancing pool. Again, Mr. Speaker, fiscal responsibility is not a luxury for government. It is a necessity. To top it off was their job-killing carbon tax, forcing families to pay to put the lights on. We put a stop to that too, Mr. Speaker. All of these are contributing factors as to why Albertans are being forced to pay such high utility bills right now. And all are examples why we cannot let the NDP near our electricity grid ever again. We are committed to fixing those mistakes and to providing real support to Albertans while we do that. Bill 18 will enable us to provide that support. Mr. Speaker, Bill 18, the Utility Commodity Rebate Act, is part of the suite of measures we're taking to maintain energy affordability in both the short term and the long term. From fiscal responsibility in the transmission and distribution systems to modernizing our grid to allow more supply, the tsunami of new generation that is set to come online, we're looking for ways to improve affordability at every turn. At this current turn, it is the rebates that we can offer to Albertans through the Utility Commodity Rebate Act. I urge the members of this Assembly to support Bill 18 so we can start to implement the promised electricity and natural gas rebates and get the money into people's pockets. I would say that this is our duty as elected officials, to see this bill passed and get these rebates out as quickly as we can. Albertans deserve nothing less. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we have an opposition, a hostile opposition, that is fighting us at every turn. I came into this chamber last night, Mr. Speaker, at 7:30 at night. I stood in front of those cameras, and I asked for unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, so that we could go to second reading of Bill 18. And do you know what they said? What? No. They refused to go to second reading of a bill that will get $280 million worth of supports out to Albertans. Shame. Now, really, should we be surprised? Let's go back a couple of years. This was the caucus that filibustered a bill that would provide support to victims of human trafficking. That's right, Mr. Speaker, victims of human trafficking, and they filibustered it. So we should not be surprised that the NDP is choosing to filibuster this. Now, I'm going to give them one more chance, Mr. Speaker. This is a piece of legislation that will provide.
The Honourable Minister, there are lounges. I'm hearing a lot of conversations happening, so I was wondering if maybe those individuals having those conversations could take them out to the lounges on either side of the House. The individual with the call is the Honourable Minister, and as everybody knows, there will be an opportunity to respond as well. So please, Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess they're laughing because they think it's funny that Albertans are struggling. Well, we don't think it's funny, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to give them one more chance. The Chief Justice will be in this legislature at 3 p.m. this afternoon. And with their help, we can get royal assent on that bill. We can push this piece of legislation through that will get $280 million into the pockets of Albertans. But in order to do that, we're going to need them to work with us. 3 o'clock this afternoon, I encourage the NDP. No, Mr. Speaker, I invite the NDP to work with us to help get $280 million into the pockets of all Albertans. This is not the piece of legislation that you want to filibuster. This is the piece of legislation that you will want to support. Mr. Speaker, I implore them, I invite them. Now, I can appreciate the energy file is a difficult file for the NDP. And not because their energy critic doesn't know the price of electricity, that's part of it. But the energy file is difficult for the NDP because they bungled it so badly. Mr. Speaker, I will be releasing an audit later on today that has audited the balancing pool's $1.3 billion losses that happened on their watch. Now, just to put in perspective, the balancing pool was an agency that actually contributed $4 billion back to ratepayers until the NDP decided to use it to pursue their ideological agenda. So I know they're angry, Mr. Speaker. They should be. They should be angry at themselves for doing this to Albertans, but this is a chance for them to show all Albertans that they will support them in their time of need. Mr. Speaker, $280 million, we would like to get it into the pockets of Albertans as soon as possible. Please, Mr. Speaker, through you to the honourable members, stop the gaslighting. Help get us this money into the pockets of Albertans because they're struggling. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Are there any individuals looking to join the debate? I see the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think since the minister raised it, that it's worth discussing what our duty to Albertans is in this place. And I think that duty starts with trust, and it starts with honesty. That minister could certainly learn a few lessons about both of those things. We were sent here to fight for Albertans, and no matter... Okay.
Order has been called. I see the government whip has risen.
23 HIJ, and I think that she just basically told us that the Associate Minister for Natural Gas and Electricity was a liar and misleading the House.
I see the honourable member for Edmonton Rutherford has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, this is not a point of order. The minister did not either say that they're a liar or imply that in any way whatsoever. Simply was in debate about the level of trust that this government has with the people of this province, and clearly evidence would indicate that there's good reason to believe that that is a debatable point and one which we will continue to bring up in this House. Thank you.
I don't have the benefit of the blues, and I believe that there was something in there with regards to could have been abusive language. However, that wasn't the point of order. However, and I didn't hear it quite perfectly whether it was directed at the government or the minister individually. I think that if it was something that was directed individually at the minister, then perhaps there's an apology there. But I don't have the benefit of the blues, and I don't have perfect recollection of what was exactly stated. What I will do is I will take this opportunity, however, to remind all members that in order for us in this House to have effective debate and do our jobs effectively, obviously decorum is required. And I think that there's been a few comments that have been made from all sides that have worked against decorum. So I would just take this opportunity to remind all members that effective debate is the goal. At this point, the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So let us begin with what this bill does. It sets up a framework to allow a rebate. What does this bill not do? It doesn't guarantee a timeline, and it doesn't guarantee a rebate. And that, Mr. Speaker, is precisely the concern that our official opposition has, because it is our duty to stand up for those thousands of Albertans who are writing into us, who are struggling with the rising cost of living due directly to decisions of this UCP government. They removed the cap on electricity. Electricity rates have skyrocketed. They made decisions around insurance that have caused insurance rates to skyrocket as a result of removing the cap, and then they attempted to hide the report that proved it so Albertans couldn't see. So no one, Mr. Speaker, trusts this government to move forward with this file. And so the fact that we are in a position where literally no member of the opposition has spoken to the bill yet, and the Associate Minister is trying to pass it off to Albertans as a filibuster, is absolutely absurd. So let's begin with the history of this file. In the fall, when this official opposition began calling on this government to do something about electricity prices, the Associate Minister rose in this House and said before all members of the Assembly on Hansard on the record that he planned to do absolutely nothing. Nothing, because skyrocketing prices, Albertans unable to afford their bills, was just the market working. Fast forward a little bit, and we have the government announcing that they're going to do a natural gas rebate. I'm sure that was a great relief to many Albertans in this province who were struggling. Except, Mr. Speaker, the program wasn't real. The government came in, they introduced a budget, and they introduced a program that wasn't going to help Albertans now. It wasn't going to help them until next fall. And when they introduced it, they didn't even introduce it with its own line item of funding, because they were hoping that they could hide from Albertans the fact that there was no money allocated to it. Now they claim it's part of some giant contingency slush fund, but Mr. Speaker, all that is an attempt to obfuscate from Albertans, an attempt to hide what's actually going on. So we had the fake natural gas rebate, and the government still claiming that they were going to do precisely nothing on electricity. Then suddenly they changed their mind. Now they want to do electricity. Now suddenly it matters. That's fine. They come forward with a rebate that their own members have referred to as paltry, because it barely touches the hundreds and thousands of dollars that some Albertans are behind on their bills. We drafted legislation that would prevent those Albertans from being disconnected from their utilities. That disconnection ban lifted on April 15th. The government refused to hear from us. They refused to even debate it. They refused to have a conversation about it because they didn't think it mattered. So we went into session on February 22nd. It's not quite 2 months ago, Mr. Speaker, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. February 22nd, we've been in session for 2 months, and 2 months later, the government comes racing forward with this bill, a bill which is essentially copied and pasted with minor alterations to include electricity from a bill that existed in 2001. And we are led to believe that now, suddenly, this is an emergency. The same government that mere months ago was claiming that this was something they shouldn't do anything about, that this was just the market working, is now telling us that it's an emergency, that they need to rush this legislation that it took them 2 months to copy and paste through the House without doing our due diligence on behalf of Albertans. Now, I know that this government likes to claim that they were sent here with the biggest mandate, but, Mr. Speaker, the official opposition was sent here for a reason too. We were sent here to hold this government to account. And this government has proved on file after file after file that they can't be trusted. They come forward, they say, trust us on curriculum, trust us on public health care, trust us on education. And they proved untrustworthy on every single one of those files. On everything that has come forward that is of importance to Albertans, they have proven that they cannot be trusted. They rescinded the 1976 coal policy with the stroke of a pen, with no announcement. They didn't tell people what was coming. Then they brought it back in and claimed they canceled all the leases, except that they didn't cancel all the leases. They canceled some of the leases. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on and on and on. So I think it is our duty in this place to take the time necessary to attempt to improve this legislation. Improve it because, again, the legislation is a framework that enables. It does not require the government to do anything. And so we are simply meant to take on faith that this government, which has dragged its heels over months, which has waffled back and forth on whether or not Albertans need help or deserve help with respect to the costs that this government has foisted upon them, we're just supposed to trust that they're going to do that? Suddenly, it's an emergency? This government has had months and months and months of doing precisely nothing on this file, but because the Associate Minister woke up yesterday and decided to copy and paste some legislation, suddenly it's an emergency? Mr. Speaker, it has been an emergency for months. This government has had the capacity to do something about it for months, and they have chosen not to. So to come before this place and claim that the problem isn't a government that has dragged its feet for months and months, that the problem is an official opposition filibustering by not even yet having spoken to the bill, is just preposterous. I think there's a few other things that ought to be addressed in the Associate Minister's comments, because I think that it is worth setting the record straight. So let us begin back with the previous Conservative government and a series of bills. Bills, Mr. Speaker, which built transmission lines. Bills that the NDP opposition objected to in the strongest possible terms. We warned Conservative governments of the day that this would cost Albertans money, that Albertans would be paying for those transmission lines for decades, that they were not necessary. We warned them and they didn't listen. They didn't listen, and they forged ahead with their ideological bent and with their ensuring that money was going to their friends. And so they forged ahead with those lines. And yes, Mr. Speaker, they did result in an overbuild. But the suggestion that when the NDP government came into office in 2015, we ought to have done what? Gone and ripped them out with our bare hands? The Conservatives had already built them. Mr. Speaker, contracts are signed. There was no getting the money back. In addition, I think it's worth noting that if you go to the projections, and these are documents that exist, if you go to the projections in terms of what projected transmission growth was and how it scaled down under our government, it proves definitively that the Associate Minister is, let me be charitable here and say, deeply confused about his own file. So this government is, trying to blame everyone but themselves. And, Mr. Speaker, in addition to this, we saw a report come out yesterday from the University of Calgary that talked about why electricity costs have skyrocketed. And it is because profits have quintupled. That is the cause, according to this paper by the University of Calgary, according to objective analysis. But the government doesn't want to talk about that. The government wants to wave their hands and make up stories and talk about things that never happened. Mr. Speaker, I think the other thing worth noting, the difference between this government and the NDP when we were in government, every decision we made was made in the best interest of Albertans, of regular people walking around out there, because that was what we were focused on. That is who we were sent here to serve. And the government could really stand to remember that. When they stand up in this place and they try to create stories about why things are happening, when they have been in power, Mr. Speaker, for nearly 3 years, and they think that they are in a position to blame literally everyone else for problems which they created. And Mr. Speaker, the idea that this legislation is the only possible way forward is completely disingenuous. There are multiple ways that this government could have proceeded. In addition, Mr. Speaker, if this government's plan was to use this legislation, they could have introduced it on the 22nd of February. We're currently in April, Mr. Speaker. So this is a huge concern. The idea that they couldn't possibly have drafted the legislation any faster, that the official opposition has to let it fly through the House, despite the fact that it doesn't contain any requirement to provide a rebate, any requirement to provide a rebate on a certain timeline, any requirement about who is getting the rebate, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it's legislation that existed before. It existed in 2001. Yes, the government has altered it to include electricity, and that is just fine. But, Mr. Speaker, it's worth discussing the fact that the government had alternate policy options. When the NDP was in government, we had a rate cap. That rate cap was already in place. They repealed it. They could have brought it back. They could have distributed the money directly to Albertans. Or, if this was the mechanism they chose, and that's their choice, they're the government, they can choose any mechanism they like, they could have brought this legislation before this House on the 22nd of February. Or, if, I don't know, they were still working to get their act together, which seems to be a pretty consistent problem on behalf of this government. Maybe they were arguing about which one it is. Maybe they just couldn't focus on this file because they were too focused on their leadership review. Who knows why it took so long? But, Mr. Speaker, even if that was the case, the leadership review happened on the 9th of April. They could have sent us the legislation to look it over. They could have had that conversation with the official opposition. They could have given their own members the heads up that they intended to move this ahead. The Associate Minister tries to write this off as a filibuster. Mr. Speaker, I was in the House last night. I saw a bill get called and the Minister of Finance rise to move that bill. And the Associate Minister come running in and jump up in front of him. Even their own members didn't know that he planned to ask for unanimous consent to move that forward. So the idea that the official opposition ought to have known is preposterous. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a government with a demonstrated lack of concern for the lives of Albertans. We have seen the Associate Minister over and over again rise in this place and belittle those concerns, belittle the costs that Albertans are facing, belittle the struggles that Albertans have when choosing whether to keep the lights on or whether to buy their groceries. Those are concerns that the official opposition has been listening to, that we have been raising, that we have been bringing forward for months now, and the government has been ignoring it. Then they announced a natural gas rebate. It was a fake program. It wasn't even coming in until next fall. They didn't anticipate that it would spend any money at all. They said that electricity, they didn't need to do anything about it, that struggling Albertans was the market working. Then they come forward and say they're going to provide an electricity rebate. But no timelines, no mechanism, no discussion of when any of that is going to happen. And then we all wait. We wait for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then the Associate Minister finally, 5 weeks later, manages to copy someone else's homework and brings forward a bill that guarantees nothing, and comes running into this House and expects the official opposition to pass it with zero scrutiny, with zero concern for the fact that we are passing legislation that doesn't guarantee anything. We could pass this legislation and then the minister could decide not to provide the direction to the companies and there would be no rebate, Mr. Speaker. We could pass this legislation and there still wouldn't be, and the minister himself admitted it. He admitted it in a news conference. He was asked when this rebate would be in the hands of Albertans and he said, well, we're kind of hoping that the companies will work with us, and we kind of hope that maybe it's going to come out in June, but maybe it might be July. So I think this idea, especially with the minister having admitted before the media that the soonest they could possibly get this rebate out the door is June, that somehow the fact that this bill wasn't passed in under 6 hours is the holdup, that's the problem, is just absurd. What it is an associate minister who is embarrassed. I am happy to give way, although I am the first speaker, so no giving way.
At this point, thank you.
Sorry. So this is an associate minister who is, essentially embarrassed by his mishandling of the file, and he is attempting to blame it on everyone else. Clear. They have been asking, Albertans have been asking this government about this issue for months, and the government has been failing to respond to them. So I think the attempts to blame everyone else and to claim that it's someone else's fault, add to that the fact that the associate minister is in charge. It is his file. The person who's responsible for doing something about the file is him. But Mr. Speaker, he has chosen to do nothing. So, you know what, Mr. Speaker, they can fling whatever they want at us. They can throw whatever wild allegations and bizarre stories their minds can invent to try and deflect from their complete and abject failure on this file, to try and deflect from their total incompetence on bringing forward this legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, Albertans aren't going to buy it. And, Mr. Speaker, it certainly will not make me sit down and stop standing up for the constituents I was sent here to serve. It certainly will not make my colleagues stop standing up for the Albertans we were sent here to serve, because those Albertans, Mr. Speaker, are struggling. They are struggling under UCP policies that have seen taxes rise, that have seen insurance rise, that have seen utility costs rise, tuition rise. The cost of borrowing on that tuition has risen, all due to the decisions of this government. And we will not stop standing up for those Albertans, because whatever the associate minister thinks the reason he was sent here for, we on this side were sent here for Albertans, and we were sent here to stand up on behalf of Albertans and to ensure that their voices are heard in this place. And nothing that they can create, no story that they can manufacture, will make us stop doing that, Mr. Speaker. And I sincerely believe that Albertans understand the truth of this matter, that Albertans know who is on their side and who is standing up for them. So I would urge the government to take a more genuine approach to this file and to start talking about the real reasons that underlie the concerns, to begin being willing to work with Albertans and with the official opposition and with experts in the public, because there are solutions, Mr. Speaker. If this government can just stop, standing up with their ideological bent and start listening to Albertans and listening to ideas and having rational conversations, there is a way forward, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I will say, I sincerely hope that we can get this done, and I sincerely hope that this government starts taking their duty to the people of this province a little more seriously.
Other members wishing to speak? I see the honourable member for Edmonton-Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to this bill, because, of course, it is the right of members of this legislature to speak to the bill, and this is our very first chance to do so, in spite of the fact that we have been accused of filibustering a bill we hadn't even had a chance to speak to. I guess, as well as other things that I keep suggesting we send over to the government side of the House, perhaps we can include a dictionary This is a very interesting bill to look at, particularly when we want to look at the history of this bill and how it arrived in this House and what's led up to this moment. First of all, we know that the UCP is doing exactly what the UCP always does, coming too late and coming with too little for the people of the province of Alberta, just like they did in so many other areas, of course, most noticeably COVID, which resulted in a significant increase in the number of deaths in this province as compared to the per population rates of deaths in other provinces. And the same thing is happening here in terms of utility rebates. First of all, we have to remember that it was just last year that the government brought in a bill on this very same topic and failed to do it right in the first place. And again, just like they have with many other pieces of legislation, they've had to come in and correct themselves and change their own bills within the year. We've had a number of examples of that. And often it's just because they are completely on the wrong side of the issue, such as they were, for example, with coal mines, when the people of Alberta clearly told them they had to do something that they did not want to do. And so, of course, they came in that case and did too little, too late, as they have in so many other situations in this province and in this legislature. So here we are reading a bill that could easily have been introduced a year ago when these first discussions were happening. But what did the minister, the Associate Minister of Gas, say to this House when he was asked about it at the time, about whether we should do something? He said what they were going to do is absolutely nothing. And he emphasized the word nothing. And then went on further to explain, it's just the market doing what the market does. And the market is working perfectly, and therefore we won't intervene. So we know that the natural position of this government and this minister is not to protect Albertans, is not to stand up and take responsibility for things, but rather to allow the whims of circumstance to have a serious effect on Albertans, without any kind of attempt by the government to do something about it and protect Albertans at a time that they need some protection from the circumstances of the era. In this case, in fact, the government could have simply chosen to do nothing from the beginning, because there was a rate cap in place. If they had done nothing, as they said they were going to do, then Albertans would have been protected to this very day. The legislation was already put in place by the previous NDP government. And that rate cap would have made sure that people were already now in 2022, and in fact, it would have been in place in 2021, would have been receiving those kind of protections that now this government is trying to figure out how to get to too little, too late. I think this is interesting that we know what their position is. We know that they removed the protections for Albertans. We know that they said they were going to do nothing. We know that they said that was just the market doing whatever they can do. And suddenly this morning, we have the Associate Minister making statements such as, and I wrote this down at the moment, so I'm going to quote it, Albertans should not have to choose between, quote, putting food on the table or putting the lights on, end quote. I can tell you that, having come from academia recently, before I got elected, if that kind of statement were done in an academic setting, you'd be charged with plagiarism for taking somebody else's speech. And I think that this minister fails to acknowledge that that kind of comment, that kind of statement, has actually been taken from and borrowed from the opposition, who've been asking for this for a long time for these very, very reasons. And so suddenly we have the minister go against all of his instincts and arrive in this House quoting the words of the opposition and other people to suddenly see the light on why they are wrong in this piece of legislation, just as they have been in so many others, such as COVID and coal mines and so on. I will cede.
No, thank you. And, I'm just, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we just saw this bill introduced on our desks yesterday, right? And so, and I would suggest as well, it's not an insubstantial money bill, right? And which is fine. I mean, we do want to make life easier for millions of Albertans in regards to their energy costs. I mean, I think that's a given. But, I mean, we'll have to work out just how much money this is, right? And to make sure that it is spent and is dispersed in the most equal and efficient way possible, right? And so I think amongst the many questions that I have, right, is, what are those mechanisms? What are those ways by which we can execute what's obviously needed and do it in the most efficient way possible?
I'd like to thank the member for that intervention, because I think it does highlight a significant point, and that is the fact that while this government is now saying this morning that this is really important and that they need to subvert democracy in this province in order to move this forward, it's clear that they have done nothing to prepare for this moment, including the fact that they have just introduced a budget into this House in which there is no specific line item dedicated to this particular topic. And so it tells me that there has been no real planning here in this event. The government did not actually sit down and cost out the costs that are involved in this particular case. And they did not look at the fact that were the rate cap in place right now, that Albertans would already have been benefiting from the legislation that was already in existence in the House. So they didn't cost out for Albertans what the actual expenses of their delayed and problematic introduction of legislation is at this particular time. We've done a number of things to try to make sure that Albertans are in good shape in this province and are able to get through these difficult kinds of times. But this government, of course, has failed to stand up at any time with that. For example, we brought in some legislation to try to extend the disconnection ban for people who are struggling at this particular time. And did this government stand up and support that? No, they did not. They did everything they could in their power to ensure that that did not happen in this House and that legislation did not proceed forward. So we know their actions speak louder than their words, that they have failed to put money into the budget for this, they have failed to plan for this, they have actually taken away the protections, they've failed to put in new protections that have been suggested by the opposition side of the House. In fact, we see this happening all the time, and they've taken the rate cap off not only electricity but also insurance, and then in that case they hid the report that would demonstrate that, in fact, that their move in that particular case was again hurting Albertans unnecessarily, because it turns out the insurance companies were in a place of receiving great significant profits and didn't need to have the rate cap removed from the insurance company point of view. So, I think this is really problematic that we find ourselves in this place, and it's really discouraging to see a government try to subvert democracy by trying to actually eliminate the process by which the people's representatives can actually question the bill that's being brought forward, and then complaining that somehow, without even having spoken to the bill, that we're filibustering the bill. And yet, if it was that important, why would the government not have put into the bill some timelines for the actual implementation of the bill and the processes that will allow that to happen? It's really important for them to not talk about it in the legislature, but it's not important for them to actually give the rebate to Albertans, because there's no timeline that forces them to do that. And we know that even if we did filibuster, which of course is an absurd thing to be saying, even if we did, let's say that we took 2 months, it still wouldn't change the date at which the Albertans got the rebate, because the rebate would be coming out in June or July at best, at a time when utility bills are not at their highest. What Albertans needed is they needed some help this winter. It was a very difficult winter for many Albertans. Costs were going up in many, many ways, and many of those directly related to the government actions in this House, taking the caps off of utilities, taking the caps off insurance, and generally just imposing difficulties on citizens in this province. And they didn't stand up and they didn't do that kind of thing. Now, we know that the government minister has complained that the NDP were involved in, oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I will see.
Please don't be sorry. I was so enthralled with your comments and insights. But of course, I know that many of my constituents have been reaching out to me on this particular issue, and you were speaking specifically about help directly for Albertans this winter. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the emails, correspondence, phone calls that you've been getting at your constituency office regarding this particular issue. Member.
Thank you to the member, because of course you know that I have received many such emails and so on, as I'm sure that you have, and I'm sure the government members have. In fact, we know they have, because they're often CC'd to us on the opposition side, because they've heard so little back from their own MLAs. People who have indicated that they have had problems with situations, including one situation, a very difficult situation in my constituency, where someone simply ended up by losing their house and having to move into an apartment because they simply couldn't pay their utility bill. Living on a fixed income for many years now. That fixed income has not gone up because, of course, government policy has kept the income fixed. And as a result, they simply had to make the decision that they no longer could afford to live in a house and had to move to an apartment where the utility bills were included, and therefore the total cost to them was significantly smaller. And it's just one individual personal tragedy. But of course, it's been duplicated time and time again, as we know from the many letters we've received about people who have not been able to survive this winter and could have used support from the government over the last 6 months to get through this difficult time. I know that the associate minister, has complained about the costs being related to transmission, which he admits in this House was actually something that was proposed by the Conservative government at the time and opposed by the NDP government. Then he goes on to complain that the NDP government didn't actually trash the decisions of the previous government when we were in office, which is a fascinating way to talk about how government should proceed. That it's our fault that we didn't stop them from being bad, that kind of thinking is something that I think is problematic. And of course, in the same breath, he complains about the fact that when we did make some changes in the balancing pool, it turned out that they had put a poison pill into the contracts, so it cost us some money. And so he's actually suggesting we should have done in this case what he says we should not have done in the other case. So clearly he is confused. Clearly he does not have a logical approach to whether or not contracts should be canceled or not. He's simply using these as talking points in order to pull the long con that we see happening here with the people of Alberta. This government has not stood up and been on the side of Albertans, and now they try to pull this ridiculous process here in the House where they prevent the representatives of the people of Alberta from even questioning the bill, and then complain out loud to the public that somehow we are stopping the bill from proceeding, when in fact anybody who understands the process of parliamentary democracy understands that is not in the least bit true. Sorry, there's an intervention, yes.
Thank you, member, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member for Edmonton Rutherford's comments on this bill, and I was hoping the member could talk a little bit about timelines. So we talk about when, I know the previous speaker had mentioned when an iteration of this bill first was tabled in the chamber many years ago, but just looking at the timelines around when the official opposition were calling for supports and real help for Albertans as prices were skyrocketing, and the fact that this bill, Bill 18, was tabled yesterday, and in a passionate and off-putting speech, the minister in one hand was attacking the official opposition, and in this next breath asking for the support of the official opposition to pass this bill expediently through the chamber, yet when could this government have brought forward a bill of this nature? When could they or should they have acted? And would love to hear the member's thoughts.
Thank you for the member for that intervention. Because I think it is clear, and it does need to be repeated yet again in this House, that this government has had plenty of opportunity to bring this forward. It was at least in the fall that we were standing up in this House asking for the government to take action on utilities. That's when we were told they would do nothing, from words from the minister's own mouth, the associate minister's own mouth. And we were told that this was just the market doing what the market does and they wouldn't interfere with the market. So we know that they've had at least 6 months to work on this, to get this together. In fact, they could have done this all when they introduced the first failed bill, and now they're introducing the second failed bill. We know that if it was really that important to them, they could have done it in the first week we were back in the House, and that's almost 2 months ago. So 2 months ago, they could have come in and resolved this and got money in people's pockets at the time they needed it most, in the middle of winter when they really needed to protect their homes from the assault of the difficult winter that we had. So there's been plenty of time here now, and the government is trying to divert people's attention away from the fact that they have failed to act. They've acted last, and they've acted least again, as they tend to in almost all situations that are important to citizens in this province. And I think that it's really shameful of the government to be in this place where they are blaming Albertans for wanting democracy to actually occur in the process of protecting Albertans at a time when rebates or some other kind of intervention is necessary. They could, of course, if they want to, go back to the really good, decent legislation that was previously in existence under the NDP government and put a rate cap back on the utilities. It would be a great situation here in this province if we had done that, because we would have been able to see not only the utility companies making a reasonable profit at all times through that process, but we would have seen Albertans being protected from huge increases. And I can tell you that many Albertans have told me the increase in the utility bills has been in excess of 100% over the period of time. And so this is the kind of thing that I think is problematic. This is the kind of thing I think this government should take some responsibility for. And unfortunately, this government's failure to take responsibility in this case is no surprise, given their failure to take responsibility for almost any of the other really terrible pieces of legislation that they brought into this House. And we have to ask, why has this government not had its eye on the ball? Why is it rushing in at the last moment, trying to do something that they could easily have done in the fall sitting, or could have done early on in this sitting, right in the middle of the winter that required people to pay these exorbitant utility bills? And the answer is, of course, that they were too busy being focused on their own internal fights, their own internal squabbles, and this sort of leadership review in which their own leader has apparently less than 35% of the support of the province of Alberta. And it would have seemed to have probably low levels of support even within the party. But, you know, we all have to wait now. We all have to wait until mid-May when the results of their leadership review is over before we see a government actually focused on governing. And that's a shame. That is something that's very problematic. Democracy has really been taking a hit under this government. It's taken a hit in terms of the government trying to move ahead in this particular case without actual proper debate, as they have in other situations. It's taken a hit, and every time the opposition... Thank you.
Other members wishing to enter the debate. I see the honourable member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to provide a few comments at this second reading stage. I am the third speaker at this stage of the Utility Commodity Rebate Act. So I am one of the first speakers to provide some comments from the floor of the legislature for this matter proposed by Executive Council, and it is up to all members, and it is indeed our right, to discuss this bill and to propose amendments to this bill for a period of time that whereby all of us members private members feel that the people's work is done and we have represented our constituents appropriately. I was reflecting last night, Mr. Speaker, on why it is that the province seems so unwilling, they're able to solve the problems that are preoccupying ordinary Albertans right now, whether it's insurance or electricity and natural gas prices. And I went back to some notes that I took in 2019 after watching the prosecution of the campaign by what has now become the modern Conservatives, and certainly a movement that is untethered from its previous iterations as something of a brokerage party. In the modern Conservative movement, losing in theatre is the goal on public policy. It is not on any matter of public policy. It's fine not to solve the problem, because that will then destabilize our faith in institutions and politics, democracy, what we can do collectively. So, you know, it's just this constant process of working the refs, of dumping money on lawyers' lawns for a fool's errand, Supreme Court references that are just a spectacular loss in terms of the carbon tax, in terms of yelling at various external actors. We certainly see this as a feature, not a bug, of modern Conservative parties throughout Western Europe as well. There's always a boogeyman. It's usually, you know, taking a page. Our playbook here, you know, took a page out of Orban's playbook, certainly in Hungary, of blaming someone else, external actors, foreign-funded shadowy figures. But for most political parties in the history of liberal democracies, winning in practice should be the goal. That is to say, solutions should be the goal. But that's not the goal. And continuing that politics of grievance is actually what we see playing out in this little micro-narrative as well. I point us to last summer when the honourable members were talking about what was the timeline of the official opposition raising this issue. Well, I recall in the summer during the heat wave, standing up with the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View discussing the spike in power prices and the risks to the grid and affordability during the heat wave in July. And after that news conference, we went and got something to eat, and we wrote out a list of possible actions the government could take. We pulled up a couple of industry experts on the phone and put them on speakerphone, ran a few things past them to get their thoughts. That's what winning in practice rather than losing in theatre looks like, is trying to find solutions. And that is why people sent us here. I go back to my notes from 2016, or 2019 rather, just after the election. You know, the UCP went into this election believing they would win 80 seats, but they didn't get that, and they won't get an easy ride in the legislature either. They will be opposed by a group of women and men who are honest, hardworking, and practical, who will name it when they give gifts to their corporate friends, when they bring in policies that do not have people's best interests in mind. That was my thoughts before coming into this chamber in whenever it was, May of 2019. And we see that kind of hubris of just refusing to solve a problem reflected in this budget. The budget address, let's go to that, in February of 24th, 2022. On page 9, we see the slapdashery, the ad hocery of the even grappling with this question of utility prices. Pushing up costs for Albertans has elevated concerns over the cost of utilities. To alleviate the fear of spiraling utility costs and to allow Albertans, misspelled, to benefit from an owned resource, budget 2022, budget not capitalized, so clearly not, these paragraphs were not edited. Yes, I will give way.
Thank you, Member. I just really appreciate what you're focused on right now, and I just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about the fact that the budgets themselves were established over the last couple of months and only introduced into the House fairly recently, and they did not include clear direction as per the bill that we're bringing in the House today. So it seemed to indicate that at the time of writing the budget, that while they certainly had been challenged on the opposition side of the House to do something about this on many occasions, they had not, in fact, planned to do this as recently as a month or so ago. And didn't put a clear line in the budget to indicate that they wanted to do this. And I wonder if you just might spend some time talking about what it is you found as you look through the budget about their really lackadaisical attitude toward this.
So yeah, I mean, when we looked at the budget documents, one of the first things we did was look for the line item of where this referenced natural gas rebate would be. I'll go back to the speech on page 9. Allow Albertans, misspelled, to benefit from an own resource. Budget 22 implements a consumer price protection mechanism similar to the measure Ralph Klein, misspelled, put in place in 2006. If natural gas prices exceed $6.50 a gigajoule, a utilities rebate will be triggered. To be clear, the word rebate, if one executes a simple Control F search in the budget speech, appears precisely once, and that's here. Will be triggered. This means Albertans needn't fear a run-up in natural gas prices of the variety currently experienced in Europe and Asia. Okay. Now, first of all, the government's own budget documents, their projections at the time do not show at any point over the fiscal forecast period natural gas going up above $6.50. Now, it is now, for obvious reasons, having to do with the geopolitical instability and the war in Ukraine. Having said that, this was clearly shoved into this speech at the last minute because the grammatical car crashes that we see in this section do not appear in the rest of the speech. It's clear that the rest of the speech was drafted, and then somebody woke up and sometime in mid-February and went, oh, I talked to a single Albertan one time and they seem really worried about utilities, so maybe we should shove something in here. When we then asked TBF officials during the briefing, okay, so where is the budget line item? Well, that doesn't exist. So where is anything for electricity? Well, that doesn't exist. Just absolutely no grappling with what we had been hearing from people since the previous summer, as I described. Now, and so we understood right away that the natural gas rebate was fake and the electricity rebate was invisible. Again, continuing grievance and blaming someone else is the point, not actually solving the problem. If the problem wanted to be solved, there was a piece of legislation that they had scrapped that they could pull off the shelf and bring back in, which was very clear of where the money was coming from and where it would be going to, and what aspects of the bill would be affected in terms of our electricity bills, and that was the rate cap. I recognize my friend from Edmonton, Ellerslie, would like to make an intervention.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member. And exactly that. I was hoping that you could cover a little bit more of the rate cap, how that actually worked in favor of Albertans when we were actually in government, and how what you're hearing now from your constituents in terms of how they appreciated that rate cap when it came to their utility bills. Would be happy to hear more about that.
So indeed, the rate cap was for the actual use portion on people's bills, and I fully recognize that there are other parts of the bill, the transmission and distribution costs, which are different across the province for different types of consumers. However, that was one piece that could be affected. And in fact, I heard from a constituent just yesterday who phoned us up and said, so where's this rebate I've been hearing about? And I have no more answers after the introduction of this bill than I had before the introduction of this bill, which says something about the quality of this legislation. The minister said yesterday, oh, well, the electricity thing might happen, in the next few months, and, oh, the natural gas thing might happen next year. That's what he said in the news conference yesterday. There's no more clarity today than there was yesterday, and that is the fundamental failing of this bill. There's no one thing that you can point to and say, okay, here's how we're going to solve the problem. Again, solving the problems, not the point. Blaming someone else for our problems is the point. Now, I've heard a little bit of other blame having to do with transmission and distribution, so I want to just put a few things on the record here because how quickly we forget. Let's go down memory lane. November 26, 2009, Bill 50, the contentious piece of legislation that would remove the requirement for public hearings on new power lines, passed third and final reading. And here's what Brian Mason, the great Brian Mason, had to say with a mighty four-person opposition. Quote, I think people are going to be reminded of this every month when they get their power bill, Mason said. It's almost like there's going to be a rider, PC arrogance, PC extravagance on everybody's power bill every month. Sound familiar? Arrogance, extravagance. These are words now applied to this group of new conservatives, and for these guys, it was after 35 years. For these guys, the new crop, it barely took them 35 days to have those sorts of monikers applied to their approach. Now, here we have Wild Rose Alliance MLA Paul Hinman, blast from the past. We needed a competitive and efficient power line, not one that's overbuilt, overpriced. It's not in the benefit of the Alberta advantage. Interesting. Now, we fast forward to 2011, when the mighty Brian Mason releases a report saying Alberta NDP leader Brian Mason says power bills will jump dramatically in the coming years as the government pushes ahead with massive new transmission lines. This from April 21st, 2011. Yes, my honourable friend.
Thank you. I've just noticed that you're going back a little bit on this and indicating that it seems that government information was available quite some time ago about the potential for an increase in electricity increases, and that the reason why the cap on our electricity was brought in under the previous government was in fact that was quite evident. And I just wonder if you might speak to the fact that in spite of the evidence that was being provided clearly by the civil service at the time and would have been fully available to the government, this government, for the last 3 years, that they chose not to intervene at any time in a 3-year period, and now suddenly they are trying to rush through a bill in the House in less than 6 hours. It seems the hypocrisy involved in that is quite extreme, and I think it's worth noting that when you've had 3 years and clearly the evidence available to you that doing things at the last second is not possible.
For Lethbridge West continues. There's also 2 extra minutes added because that was your third intervention as well. Perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, there's no question that it was known to this House and to the people of Alberta that those PC decisions that were taken in 2011 were going to have an effect over the long term. These are massive decisions, multi-billion-dollar projects. They don't show themselves on people's bills overnight. And yet, here we are in 2011. Mason pointed to a study done by the Alberta Direct Connect Consumer Association of Large Industrial Power Consumers. The study suggests the transmission costs on power bills are set to jump by 65% in the next 2 years. Mason says these hikes will happen because the province is overbuilding power lines. And then, later on, May 9th, 2011, Alberta's New Democrats say the provincial government is being willfully blind to evidence that new power line construction will send electricity bills through the roof. Mason said it's time the province repealed legislation passed 2 years ago that allows Cabinet to approve power line construction without public hearings if it deems the lines are necessary. Now, of course, this minister has suggested that we, that it would have been more prudent to cost the taxpayer billions of dollars in extra by breaking contracts, which is not a way to welcome in new investments, certainly does not inspire confidence in the power market, and certainly would have undermined our ability to attract the lowest cost renewables in Canadian history. or make sure that we had the right investment climate in place for coal to gas conversions, something that the Harper government failed to do in 2012 when they phased out 12 of our 16 coal-fired electricity plants, of which this Premier sat at the cabinet table, twiddled his thumbs, and did not give a thought to the workers that he would be affecting by those decisions of 12 of the 16 plants being phased out. Be that as it may, now his idea is that we should have ripped up those contracts, and yet this minister hasn't, even though he rails about the coal-fired electricity phase-out. Has he ripped up the contracts? He certainly has threatened to do so, not inspiring confidence for investment in renewables. And yet, but he has also sat by while the Minister for Environment and Parks raises the carbon tax on industrial emitters to $50 per ton. Apparently that's not really a carbon tax. It is. It's absolutely a price on carbon. They haven't repealed the carbon competitiveness, the output-based allocations program, none of those things. And so, again, solving the problem, however the problem is defined on the other side, is not the point. The constant grievance is the point. Theater is the point. Artifice is the point for these modern Conservatives, not actually meeting the concerns and solving the problems of ordinary people. I will cast my mind back to right around the time of estimates debate, when there was an audio that came from the finance minister's town hall, where a woman came to him and said, I have thousands of dollars in utility costs, what are you going to do about it? And he said, yes, my wife tells me we also have thousands of dollars in utility costs. Anyway, did not propose a solution to the problem. No wonder his budget address had this kind of slapdash, grammatically incorrect sop to caring, maybe in a perfunctory and performative way, about the rising cost of electricity. And you notice, even in the budget address, it says not to solve the problem, but to solve the fear of the problem. In other words, we're not going to do anything at all to help people. And so you'll have to pardon the official opposition who were sent here to practically solve problems, who were sent here in a faith that we will put people first, that the point of being here is to focus on solutions, not grievance. You will have to forgive us for wondering out loud why now the Chief Justice is going to be used in some kind of performance art, in some kind of kabuki theater this afternoon at 3 o'clock to solve this particular issue. We would happily have even come back into the House early because everyone knew that electricity and natural gas bills were rising. We would have happily come back into this House to solve that problem early in February, just as we would have been just as happy to come back in here and make legislative amendments to the Traffic Safety Act so that we could clear out that $44 million a day disgrace that was happening down at the Coots border and hurting the southern Alberta economy. We would have done that too. Because our job is to come in here and propose solutions, not to bang the pot of grievance. So that is what we will focus on with our amendments, with the process. We will respect the rules of this House. We will not try to abuse the process. We will make sure we are doing the people's work. And we will make sure that even while the Conservatives on the other side and this modern Conservative movement just goes around spinning false narratives, telling fairy tales, trying to scare people with a boogeyman of who we are and what we might be, they can go around telling all those tales about us, and guess what? We will tell the truth about them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Goldbar has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and offer a few thoughts and share some views of constituents on this issue of Bill 18, the Utility Commodity Rebate Act, because as all of the previous speakers before me have mentioned, Albertans have been loud about the price of electricity and the price of natural gas, and they want the government to do something about it. And so I thought I'd first share some of the emails that I've received to my office here in Edmonton Gold Bar, and then discuss the likelihood of this piece of legislation meeting the needs that the people of Edmonton Gold Bar have identified. So the first email that I'd like to share was sent to me on Monday, February 14th of this year. Happy Valentine's Day. Your electricity bill is $1,000 essentially. It says, "Good afternoon. I'm writing to you today expressing concern about the recent increase in utility rates. My heat and power rates have more than doubled in the last month. I was quite shocked to see such an increase. So many families are struggling in this current environment, and unexpected charges like this can be incredible hardships for many. I spoke to a neighbor whose bill was close to $1,000 last month, and a fellow business owner who had to make the difficult choice of keeping an employee on staff or keeping the lights on in his business. Unfortunately, he had to let an employee go. This is not sustainable for anyone. I urge you to explore the increased charges so many Albertans are facing and identify solutions to reel in the charges suppliers are grasping for." And that came from Lindsay, who is a resident of Edmonton Gold Bar. On February 8th, I had another email with the subject concern regarding utilities. It says, "My name is Serenity, and I'm a full-time university student as well as a mother to 2 young children. I'm writing to you today in order to highlight some concerns regarding the utility distribution charges here in Edmonton. As you already know, times are tough right now, and COVID has hit our world hard. I'm utterly disappointed to see how high the utility bills are becoming here in Edmonton. It feels as though the utility companies are taking advantage of Albertans and kicking us while we were already down. Our usage of power, water, and gas has been quite standard with only small fluctuations, yet my most recent bill is more than double what it usually is. $750 in utilities this month, with nearly $400 of that being distribution charges. How are we supposed to feed our families when the cost of living is constantly rising and most of us are on fixed incomes? The price cap needs to come back. Albertans deserve fair prices and shouldn't have to choose between heating our homes or putting food on our table. I really appreciate you taking the time to read through my concerns, and I look forward to hearing from you. All the best, Serenity." And my heart goes out to this person because, of course, as a university student, not only is she faced with the tremendous spike in electricity and natural gas prices, but the Minister of Advanced Education has jacked up her tuition and other related university fees as well. And so she's been hit hard by a number of terrible policy decisions that this UCP government has made. On February 15th, I had an email from Deb about unacceptable utility rates. I'm a homeowner, and I'm writing to complain about the ridiculously high utility rates that I and every other Albertan is paying. I don't get charged all kinds of fees and distribution charges for my water. Why do I pay more in charges and fees than the actual cost of the product for my gas and power? On my latest bill, statement date January 22nd, 2022, the cost for my electricity was $107.24, and I paid an additional $140.25 in charges and fees. The cost for my natural gas was $112.77, and I paid an additional $243.90 in fees and charges, more than twice the cost of the product. My senior mother, living in a 1-bedroom apartment, receiving a $500 a month subsidy to afford her rent, another piece of important government support that has been either frozen or cut by this terrible UCP government, was charged $79.71 for her billing period of December 10th of 2021 to January 11th of 2022. During that period, she was at my house for an entire week. She used 220 kilowatt hours of electricity and was charged over 16 cents per kilowatt hour. The cost of her electricity was $32.39, and she paid $47.32 in admin fees, distribution charges, transmission charges, etc. Deb says, "This is robbery. Yes, I did call EPCOR and get my mom locked into a much lower rate for her electricity, but it's all of the additional charges that the average person cannot afford." And I hope that the Associate Minister listened to that last point very closely, because we've heard him stand up time and again and tell Albertans to just go to their utility and beg for lower rates, which does absolutely nothing to address the distribution charges that people are paying. So that's an important point that Deb raised for that. She goes on to say, "These incredible fees and charges have to stop. Albertans are being taxed and charged to death. I pay over $5,000 a year in property taxes. My provincial taxes go up and up, something that this government has refused to address. You know what doesn't go up, she goes on to say? My income, not one penny. So I would like to know what the province of Alberta is going to do to bring these fees and charges down. When will Albertans quit being gouged with unaffordable fees and charges for the basic utilities we all need? An excellent question, Deb, and I wish the Associate Minister had come into the House today with answers to that question, but unfortunately he did not. And that leads to the next point that I want to make, that Deb raised in the last email that I read into the record. When will Albertans see relief from high utility prices? Well, according to the piece of legislation that we have here in front of us for debate this morning, we don't know. And not only do we have no indication from the piece of legislation that we're debating here this morning, the Associate Minister of, I forget his title. The Associate Minister had no further answers when he introduced this legislation in a press conference yesterday afternoon. Now, I managed to catch a couple of clips from that press conference, and it was so uniquely bad, Mr. Speaker, you could have sworn that it was ripped from the television show Veep or one of these other political satires, where it was so terrible that you would have to believe that it was fiction, because you wouldn't think that any minister would actually hold a press conference and embarrass himself so badly in front of the entire province of Alberta. Because he was asked over and over again, when will people see the rebates? And he couldn't provide any answers. He refused to answer the question. The best that he could have come up with is that maybe if we go to the utility companies on our hands and knees and beg them to cooperate with the government, we might be able to get a rebate into the hands of people by July, or end of June at the very earliest. Well, that is cold comfort to the people who have already paid thousands and thousands of dollars in electricity and natural gas bills over the last 3 months and won't see any reduction in their bills in the upcoming months. So I'm proud to stand with my colleagues, especially my friend from Calgary Mountain View, the official opposition critic for energy, when she says that it's our job to make sure that we hold the government accountable to the promises that they've made and pressure them into actually committing to a timeline for getting the rebates into the hands of Albertans and just coming clean with how much they can expect to be rebated. Because that's the other piece that isn't clear here in this piece of legislation. We've heard rumblings and commitments made at the last minute from the Premier and other members of Executive Council about how much Albertans can expect to pay. We think that they're going to get $50 for an electricity rebate, which is not even 5% of what some of the constituents in Edmonton Gold Bar are getting. Well, here's $50. Hope you can cover the other $950 that you were charged for electricity in the month of February. That's not help. And I see that my friend here from Edmonton West Henday would like to intervene, and so I will entertain that intervention.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I've appreciated the comments so far, and like the member speaking, I am also very happy or appreciate the comments that have come forward from the member from Calgary Mountain View as well, and appreciate the work that that member has done on this file, specifically thinking back to a few weeks ago when that member called for a reinstatement of the moratorium on utility shutoffs, something that this government has been unwilling to follow through with. So when we're talking about real support for Alberta families, I mean, we've proposed as a caucus many more supports past that, even early on to the pandemic, pandemic. So I find it very rich that the Associate Minister of Natural Gas is now coming back and telling us we need to rush this through when for essentially several months, if not even years, looking back to early days of this pandemic when the utility cap came off and the government decided not to reinstate that as well. I mean, there's been so many opportunities for this government to take action to show Albertans that they truly support them when it comes to lowering their bills, but they haven't. Thank you.
I want to thank my friend from Edmonton West Henday for raising this important point, and it builds on something that my friend from Lethbridge West highlighted in her speech as well. That the point of the modern conservative movement isn't to provide meaningful solutions to the people of the province of Alberta, it's only to drum up grievances and assign blame to other actors in the hopes of, whipping up the mob and generating political support from that. That was a tactic that was incredibly effective in the 2019 election when the UCP was not in power. But I think they so effectively whipped up the mob, they made promises to the people of Alberta that they were going to be able to fix all of the problems that we were facing. And now they've fallen flat. And the old trick of whipping up the mob doesn't work anymore because everybody knows that they have the power to make progress on these issues. They have the power to implement solutions, and they don't want to do that. And that's quite clear from the bill that we have here today. It's, as my friend from Lethbridge West said, complete political theater. There are a whole host of other public policy options that are available to the government that didn't even require this piece of legislation to be brought forward. As my friend from Calgary Mountain View said, they could have left the electricity rate cap in place. And just a reminder, we capped the electricity price at 6.8 cents a kilowatt hour. The regulated rate option right now for EPCOR customers is something around 10.6 cents a kilowatt hour. So had the government done nothing but just left the rate cap in place, electricity consumers in my riding would be paying 30% less for electricity than they are right now. That's all the government had to do was nothing. They've done, and I don't know why they didn't choose to do nothing, because they've done nothing on a whole host of other issues. I would say doing nothing is their strong suit. But they couldn't leave well enough alone. They had to lift the electricity cap. And now the people of Alberta are paying, or literally paying, thousands of dollars for that poor public policy decision. That was one thing they could have done. They could have simply written a check to Albertans. They could have sent out a $50 check to every household in the province of Alberta. That doesn't require a piece of legislation. I'd like to hear the Minister of Electricity tell us why he couldn't just write a check. I suspect that might actually impact the bottom lines of the electricity distributors that whose interests he's so interested in protecting. We saw that during the initial stages of the pandemic when the government brought forward utility deferrals. Well, heaven forbid that EPCOR or NMAX be out money because people can't afford to pay their bills during the worst economic downturn that this province has seen in its history. No, we need to keep EPCOR and NMAX whole, so we're going to lend them a bunch of money to cover the unpaid bills for Albertans. I suspect that's exactly what's going on here too. This government needs to make sure that its rich friends in the electricity industry are still making more money than they've ever made before. And that's why the people of Alberta have to wait 6 months to get a $50 check. So it's extremely frustrating that people like Deb and Serenity and Lindsay and my riding have to wait and wait and wait. At least 6 months, probably more. They may never even see a natural gas rebate because we still don't know, we don't have any details about how much money they're going to provide. Yeah, and as my friend from Edmonton Northwest says, in the meantime, they could have their electricity and natural gas completely shut off, and this government wouldn't lift a finger to do anything to prevent it. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I see the Honourable Government Whip has risen.
Mr. Speaker, you know, it's pretty unfortunate that the NDP have chosen to play politics with Albertans' utilities bills. Well, it is. They're seemingly intent on making sure that Bill 18 is prevented from being passed this morning. And let me be clear, by not providing unanimous consent last night, they have, and wasting time this morning, they've basically made it sure that they've stopped $280 million from being returned to Albertans. By the way, that amount is more than the NDP spent on their precious rate cap. So again, it's disappointing, but hardly surprising, and it's with deep regret that we have run out of time this morning. We won't be able to have Bill 18 get royal assent this afternoon, but at this time I'm going to move to adjourn debate. Thanks.
I wouldn't presume the will of the Assembly prior to that being known. However, on the question with regards to adjourning debate, having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Government Whip and Associate Minister of Women's Status of Women, sorry, I was to adjourn debate. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. All right, that is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for third reading, Bill 9, Public's Right to Know Act. Honourable Mr. Shandro.
I see the Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to be here today to move third reading of Bill 9, the Public's Right to Know Act, which will make it easier for Albertans to find information about crime in their community. We believe that people have a right to know how crime is affecting their community, and this legislation is delivering on a platform commitment of ours to bring in legislation that will affirm and strengthen that right. Now, if passed, this legislation would require the provincial government to report crime and justice system metrics annually. And this would involve publishing information like crime-based, police-based crime data on the Government of Alberta website, and by tabling the information in a report to this House every year. Now, it's important to point out that while to some this may seem modest, I can say that it is not the case. We are merely at the starting point here. It's important to note that this is enabling legislation. What it does is it creates a framework for reporting crime and justice metrics, not only now, but as well into the future. Additional metrics can be reported as they become available to us and as we work with our partners to develop those new metrics. And the Minister of the Day would then have the ability to enter into information sharing agreements to obtain and then publish the data respecting crime and the justice system. Now, indeed, this is just the beginning, and there will be increasingly more data and more helpful information to a variety of Albertans in the coming years. This piece of legislation that we're debating here, Mr. Speaker, is a first in Canada. Alberta is proactively taking a leadership role and modeling the way for other provinces. No other jurisdiction has standalone legislation requiring the government to report crime and justice system metrics to the public at defined intervals. This annual reporting requirement would enhance transparency by creating an expectation among the public that the government will provide Albertans with this information at regular intervals and ensure it's easy to find and easy to understand. Now, to that end, Alberta Justice and Solicitor General is looking at ways to present the raw data that we receive in more user-friendly ways, and that could mean, for example, giving people the ability to examine trends over time. Contrary to what members opposite have claimed, access to this kind of data is indeed a priority for Albertans. During a tour of the province in 2019, a former Minister of Justice and Solicitor General heard from many rural Albertans who were concerned about crime, and they also told them that they wanted more information about what's happening in their communities. And our conversations with Albertans indicate that there's a strong appetite for this kind of information, as well as valid reasons for people who want it. Transparency is an important principle, but increased openness isn't the only benefit to legislation like this. We've all heard the saying, knowledge is power, and there's a reason that expressions like this have become part of our everyday language. It's because they're often true. Information and easier access to it empowers people to make better decisions. Improving access to crime data could help decision makers at various levels develop policies and to take actions that are based on evidence. A troubling crime trend could expose gaps in services and lead to the development of new initiatives or perhaps even new enforcement strategies. And at a more basic level, this is also about giving Albertans the ability to make better decisions about their personal safety. Knowing property crime statistics in their community may cause someone to take added steps to protect their homes or their businesses, such as installation of better lighting, security, other measures to deter thieves. What these examples have in common is that in all these cases, having better access to information can result in better outcomes. An informed and empowered public can help build safer communities for everyone in Alberta. And it starts with ensuring that folks have easier access to information. I hope that members on both sides of the House will support this legislation for what it can mean to Albertans and how it can help them out in the years to come. I ask that we move third reading of Bill 9. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. To respond, I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Beverly Clareview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak to Bill 9, the Public's Right to Know Act. But before I launch into that bill, I just want to make a comment, Mr. Speaker, about the previous bill that was under discussion, Bill 18, and the government's and the final comments made that the opposition was being criticized for not giving the government unanimous consent, thank you very much, to move the bill expediently through, yet then the government adjourned debate. So if the bill was that important, we should have continued to discuss it.
However, I think we are on third reading of Bill 12, so if we could please bring our comments back to the task at hand. Sorry, Bill 9, third reading.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to make that comment so that it's clear to Albertans at home that we're wondering why the Assembly was not continuing to debate a bill that was so important yet brought in 6 months late. But here we have Bill 9, the Public's Right to Know Act, which, you know, I do have a number of questions. And, you know, my first reading of this bill is that everything in this bill, the minister currently has the authority to do. So what we have here is either a job description bill or a bill that allows the minister to check a box for a promise made, yet the ability the minister already had. The minister can commission reports. The minister who's now yelling across the way. And so, you know, this bill could have and should have done much more. And I want to talk a little bit about, Mr. Speaker, the fact that this very government raided the Victims of Crime Fund in a bill that they brought forward a couple of years ago. And that this bill has had the capacity to be able to ensure that every dollar from the Victims of Crime Fund would go to victims. And yet, it was expanded to cover a myriad of programs to which, Mr. Speaker, there's been a number of articles that, and stakeholders and not-for-profit groups who support victims of crime, who were devastated and frustrated with this government, and were sounding the alarm bells before this government made changes to the Victims of Crime Fund, which previously Since that fund was initially established in the province, all funds were going to victims. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that some of those victims, well, I mean, they're all victims, but many of them suffered incredible atrocities and needed long-term support in order to for some to get back to functioning. And so those funds were critical, but the funds were limited. You know, and there's, and I'm happy to table this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, some articles that I'm gonna quote from. You know, first of all, Mr. Speaker, an article that appeared in the CBC, New Victims of Crime Benefits Delayed, Existing Alberta Program Limits Naive, advocates say. And in this, the first challenge that these organizations had is that victims had 45 days after a violent crime to apply for benefits. Now, I'm no expert in this area whatsoever, but putting a limitation of 45 days after someone has experienced something extremely traumatic seems a little absurd to me. That window is so small for a person who's been a victim of a crime to apply for support. And it's pointed out, you know, that Albertans used to have 2 years from the date of crime, and that was backed up all the way to 45 days, which is a significant change, Mr. Speaker. You know, I can tell you that the CEO of the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton had said that this is a really naive and, quite frankly, uninformed to make a decision about what it means for a survivor to even acknowledge to themselves what happened, let alone report, which I think is a very compelling argument. There's now also a limit of $1,000 on reimbursements for counseling, and which is nowhere near enough to cover the amount for treatment most victims need. Again, if you think about, Mr. Speaker, the fact that a 1-hour session is on average about $200. So, you know, for a victim of a crime, they would have maybe 5 sessions total. Again, you know, others had called this move ridiculous. Again, you know, it's troubling, Mr. Speaker. I know I'm going to pull up another article that talks about a number of not-for-profits. There's a group in this next article, Mr. Speaker, entitled, it was on CTV News, Concerns Raised Over Planned Changes to Alberta Victims of Crime Fund. So here's an example of a group that represents 73 victim service organizations in the province. So quite a large umbrella organization that was raising the alarm bells over the proposed, at that time, changes to that the UCP government were going to make to the victims of crime. And again, you know, the frustration is that it would allow the provincial government to raid a fund that was meant to support people and families hurt by crime. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, this is something that could have been in this bill. Real, meaningful action to either restore the money that was taken out of that fund or to add new dollars into the fund to support those. Now, my understanding is that when this bill was first introduced or around that timeline, that the minister made comments around even the necessity of this bill and whether or not it is necessary to do what the bill enables the minister to do. You know, the challenge that many of my colleagues have raised regarding this bill is that it does not address the concerns that Albertans have, and it doesn't specify which data has to be recorded or collected. Now, I'm sure the minister, as his colleagues have been doing for every bill we're debating in this chamber, oh no, that's in the regulations, just trust us. Trust us, trust us, trust us. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that, and I think all parties in this chamber are pretty aware of Albertans' level of trust in this UCP government. So here was an opportunity to provide race-based data that would give real information to be able to look at what changes need to be made and where the system is failing people. So that's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker. Now, my understanding, again, of the data that this bill enables the minister to report on is that the minister already had the ability to create reports and share with the public. Again, it's not in the bill as far as what data is actually going to be collected. And I think Albertans have reason to be concerned as far as what data will be collected, what data will be shared. So I'm curious, and I'm sure the minister already heard this question, but without this bill, would the minister be able to publish a report on individuals on bail or on parole, as was promised in the platform? I would like to know why the minister chose not to include specifically which data will be included or disclosed. I don't know if the minister knows that and doesn't want to disclose it here in the chamber, or if the minister doesn't know as of yet. Maybe this bill was written hastily. I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker. Our job is to try to get answers to these questions. Now, I'm not sure if the minister is going to be supporting Bill 204. That's in committee right now, but before this House, that was put forward by my colleague, the member for Edmonton City Centre, which proposes the collection of race-based data. Which is what many communities have been asking for in order to identify exactly, where the problems lie, and will provide us with information to be able to make data-driven decisions. So I hope that the minister will support that. Again, Bill 204 will allow the collection of data about the justice system, which, many of the constituents I've spoken with have felt frustration with our current justice system, identifying that there is significant room for improvement on it, and again, collecting data to be able to make informed decisions on how to improve our system, I think is a good thing. And I would hope that all members of this chamber would support improving our system to ensure that Albertans have access to justice, quite frankly. That bill as well also would create the Anti-Racism Advisory Council to make recommendations based on data collected, which again, in my opinion, is a good thing to have the input and advice of a council Now, this current bill, Bill 9, does none of these things. It doesn't provide any tools to create recommendations based on the data presented. So it, there's no direction, there's no guidance through this bill on, again, what information will be collected, how it'll be used, who will have access to it. I think the bill in and of itself, from what I can see, Mr. Speaker, does nothing to address crime. So as I had mentioned, it doesn't restore funding to the victims of crime. It doesn't prioritize the new victim of crime model. It doesn't prioritize hiring more prosecutors, which is one of the challenges that our system is currently facing, and why we have so many cases being thrown out, because the timelines lapse, because there simply aren't enough prosecutors. And so why doesn't this bill work to address that issue? I mean, again, there was an opportunity here that the government's missed. It doesn't present a plan to make sure that criminal cases are not thrown out due to delays in prosecuting them within the Jordan timeframes, which again could have been in this piece of legislation. And as well, Mr. Speaker, I know the associations for our municipalities, both Alberta municipalities and the rural municipalities of Alberta, RMA, have been telling this government to abandon this idea of a provincial police force and to focus on addressing the root causes of crime. Now, what's fascinating, Mr. Speaker, is while we are debating this bill recently, in fact, I learned of it yesterday, that 10 fish and wildlife officers are being dropped from a task force that was created to respond to rural crime. Now, significant dollars were spent training these officers, equipping them with everything from body armor to carbine rifles, etc., which at first I found curious, Mr. Speaker, but then recognizing that our fish and wildlife officers are often in remote rural areas of Alberta and can respond in a more timely manner to rural calls for help. And so I can only imagine how the organization within Fish and Wildlife had restructured in order to take on these new responsibilities, staff up, train, procure equipment, etc. And with a stroke of a pen, they're no longer part of that task force. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is to the minister and to the government. So there's fewer officers now responding to rural crime. So for a government and a party that brags about being tough on crime, they're the opposite. The UCP are weak on crime and clearly are not prioritizing the safety of rural Albertans. I would love for the minister to stand up and explain to the chamber why they dropped these 10 officers from responding after they have been trained. And this isn't just taking one little course, Mr. Speaker. This is so that fish and wildlife officers have the knowledge of all sections of law and the criminal code to be able to lay charges, to act in essence as an RCMP officer. My understanding is that the training went on for more than a year. And suddenly, with no word from the minister or this government, They're dropped. Who's going to pay for that decision? You know who's going to pay for it, Mr. Speaker? Rural Albertans. The very ones who have been talking about wanting meaningful action, to which this UCP government promised in their platform. And now they're failing to deliver. Again, this bill could have addressed the backlog in our court system, and it didn't. It could have dropped this, I'm trying to think of a parliamentary way of framing this concept of an Alberta police force, which clearly is just trying to pander to the extreme of this government's political party. Because, you know, Mr. Speaker, and I even asked some of the accountants over there, show me the math. Show me the math on creating a provincial police force. How many millions of dollars would that create? Millions. How long would it take for that police force to have a system that actually can talk to the existing RCMP system? Albertans aren't asking for a provincial police force. Don't take my word for it. Go talk to the rural municipalities of Alberta. Don't even talk to just the association. Talk to the actual individual municipalities, rural municipalities. And how many of them are asking for an Alberta police force? Now, maybe there's one or two. I don't know. Everyone that I've spoken with had said, nope, not a chance. We'd like to see more funding. What they didn't want to see was what this government did, which was download the costs of policing onto municipalities. And so, Mr. Speaker, for those reasons and many others, I struggle with this bill.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to rise to speak to Bill 9, the Public's Right to Know Act, and I have appreciated the conversations that we've heard so far this morning, and even before that, and you know, some of the comments that I plan to make through this time that I have speaking to Bill 9 will likely reflect some of the words that we just heard from the member from Edmonton, Beverly Clairview, because I also share many concerns, not only with the legislation itself, but also what is clearly missing, and also the bigger picture of some of the other pieces that we've seen the government move on that have had negative impacts and consequences on the justice system and supports for victims of crimes across the province. And so first of all, I would again repeat that this legislation does little to address the priorities of Albertans. You know, we see in this legislation very vague references to the ability that is, you know, going to be given to the minister, but it does seem that for the most part, or for the entirety of what we're seeing in here, it's very likely that the minister is able to produce and request this information in the first place, and not entirely sure exactly why we need this legislation in the first place, and would be happy to hear some specific examples from the Justice Minister if they so choose to rise and speak to some of the maybe information that they've requested in the past that they haven't been able to have provided to them, and exactly what they expect to get into the future from this legislation if it were to pass. Because, again, from what we see in here, like many other pieces of legislation that this government has brought forward, it's very vague and leaves the opposition and many Albertans wondering exactly what the intentions were when this bill was introduced. Now, specific to some of the things, some of the issues that we've seen and the decisions that this government has made, I think that we've heard to some extent discussions around the Victims of Crime Fund, and I plan to spend some time on that. Specifically, again, the previous member referenced this article from the CBC dated January 10th of this year, and concerns that have been brought forward by many advocates within this field, but specifically in this case, Mary Jane James, the CEO of SACE, the Sexual Assault Centre of Edmonton, which is located in the constituency of Edmonton West Henday. And the work that they do is so important, and the education that they provide is so important, and the value that they bring as advocates and as supporters of the work of protecting and supporting survivors is so important. And so it's always a concern when the government is bringing forward legislation that is bringing out advocates like members from the Sexual Assault Centre of Edmonton, and they're putting forward that there's red flags in what the government is proposing. And so again, I think that we've had ample opportunities, or this government has had many opportunities to rectify the problems that they've created. I think that this legislation itself could have potentially been another opportunity for that, but instead, again, we see vague commitments to collecting data with little information about what exactly we might be collecting. And just reflecting on the decision that this government made to, quote unquote, expand the ways that the money from the Victims of Crime Fund could be spent. And first of all, we saw about 60% of that fund being diverted to other programs. And on top of that, in this last budget, that we've actually seen a 12% cut to that fund. And so in both of those circumstances, that is very concerning. We see money being diverted to paying for courts and policing initiatives, and well, they say hiring more Crown prosecutors. It doesn't seem like that's going so well, even with the added funds that they're taking away from victims of crime, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is, they are now allowed to use that money that was once entirely designated for those who are trying to deal with traumatic experiences and get the supports and therapy and everything else that comes along with it. And the previous member also reflected on the fact that the government has moved to put a $1,000 limit on reimbursements, and we see stories from previously, before that limit was put in place, where Albertans who have been victims of crime have been reimbursed or received compensation of upwards of $10,000 in some cases. And that is entirely understandable, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker, that we should be doing everything we can to support these people. But unfortunately, this government has gone in the exact opposite direction. And so this is just one more instance of the government completely failing on the justice file, really across the board. And I would say, specific to this issue, that what is potentially most concerning or most questionable about the decisions of this government is the fact that so many of them come from rural communities. And I would say in many instances that the need to support victims is, or not the need, but the barriers to supporting victims in rural communities is potentially higher than we might see in urban settings. Obviously, we have more associations and advocates within our urban centers, and potentially more opportunities to receive supports, whether it is from police or advocacy organizations or wherever a victim or a survivor might feel safe going to. But instead of ensuring that those funds are in place and that we keep that 2-year time limit, we actually saw the government go backwards down to a 45-day time limit, which, again, might be even worse for those people in rural communities who have been victimized in one way or another. And so I find that concerning and question why so often the decisions of this government are actually negatively affecting rural Albertans, potentially even more so than those in urban centers. We heard from the previous minister the idea of Jordan's principle and the risk of cases being thrown out because ongoing delays based on the lack of supports in the justice system. And it was also very interesting to see from the current Justice Minister when the idea that this was happening, that there was more than 3,000 cases in the provincial court alone that were at risk of being tossed out, that when that story initially broke, that the minister actually said that this wasn't the case, that even though they've gone past this 18-month timeline, there's no chance that this is going to happen. But again, advocates from within the community came out and said that the minister was wrong. Defense lawyers came out and said that absolutely it's possible that, upwards of 1,282 violent cases are at risk of being thrown out in the provincial court. And so it's hard, again, when we look at Bill 9 and the vagueness and the lack of detail and the fact that we're being told that much of the important parts of the legislation will come through regulations. It's hard to, again, support or believe that the government is on the right track with the vagueness of it and with the track record that this government has already put forward, and also with their inability to be straightforward with Albertans, Mr. Speaker. I think that the discussion around the Jordan cases is a great example of that. I think that the denial of the truth or denial of the facts around the Victims of Crime Fund through this process leave Albertans concerned about the track record of this government. And further, like the previous member, I have great concerns, and I know Albertans, by and large, have great concerns about the fact that right now, as brought forward again, on April 6th of this year, that document is titled Alberta Crown Prosecutors Meet to Consider Strikes. So again, we have the Crown prosecutors in the province who, rightfully so, are concerned that even though in the UCP's platform in 2019, the Premier committed to hiring 50 new prosecutors, but at this point, there are still 37 vacancies. And so now they're considering job action because of a lack of resources, a lack of what seems like respect coming from people above them in terms of the minister and the ministry's office potentially, as well as the caseloads that continue to grow and grow. And so they feel that they're being unheard or aren't being listened to, and they are considering job action now. So across the board, it seems like the justice system or the responsibilities of this minister aren't being taken as seriously as they should be. The resourcing isn't there. And there are major concerns. I think the previous member said this government calls themselves tough on crime, but it seems like quite the opposite when we look at the decisions that they've made. And I would reflect on the fact that not only are we seeing policing costs downloaded onto municipalities, even before we have this discussion about moving to a provincial police force, but they are also taking more portions of things like traffic tickets. And so they're taking with both hands, Mr. Speaker, not giving back with any hand, taking with both of them. And unfortunately, what this means is more costs on Alberta municipalities, which in turn means more costs on Alberta residents across the board for these for the money that is being taken away from municipalities, but it also means less services provided by those organizations within their community. And that really goes back to the point here of Bill 9 and the Public's Right to Know Act, and the, though very vague, the idea of increasing the transparency and oversight and opportunities for the Justice Minister to request information. I absolutely feel that in principle, the idea that is put forward in this legislation is something that I am willing to support. Again, the main concern here is the lack of clarity in what exactly the minister is hoping to get out of it. And also the lack of clarity if it is going to result in essentially more paperwork or more work for these organizations within our community on the ground, who we, of course, with the scaling back of funds from this government, we need to ensure that there is adequate staffing, whether it's policing in rural communities or otherwise. And we continue to talk about the fact that they need to be out in the community as best as possible. We need to ensure that they're in the community supporting families and not necessarily stuck behind a desk. Now, if we are going to ask them to provide more data for the work that they're doing, which is, again, I support that idea, but we need to ensure that the resources are in place to ensure that it's not going to mean a reduction in the people in the community and on the street level. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I do believe that I, again, support in general the principles that are put forward by Bill 9. I have major concerns about the direction of this government overall when it comes to the justice ministry and the justice system. But with that, I will take my seat and hear from some other colleagues. Thank you.
Looking for other members wishing to join debate. I see the honourable member from Edmonton-Ellerslie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, yesterday during debate on Bill 9 in Committee of the Whole, I made reference to dealing with issues of justice as they relate to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the prison system here in the province of Alberta, but as well federally. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to go delve a little bit deeper into what I brought up then in debate, which were the sentencing circles. And I promised that I would, during Bill 3, mention it a little bit in more detail. So I do have a description here that I wanted to share with everybody. Now, and I remind all the members of the House that this is so important because this is a practice that's already taking place in many jurisdictions across Canada. And the Edmonton Police Service decided to pilot a project very recently in the last couple of years. And I want to encourage all of us to promote this because I honestly believe that this is a nonpartisan issue, that we need to work on it in terms of reconciliation with Indigenous nations all across Canada. And of course, it's a great alternative to making sure that these can be situations can be dealt with in a more productive manner for Indigenous people, and that is more fair, I would say. So according to the document that I have, it says this, and I'll quote directly from it, Mr. Speaker. I'll be sure to table this later on today. A sentencing circle is a community-directed process conducted in partnership with the criminal justice system to develop consensus on an appropriate sentencing plan that addresses the concerns of all interested parties. Sentencing circles, sometimes called peacemaking circles, use traditional circle ritual and structure to involve the victim, victim supporters, the offender, offenders' supporters, judge and court personnel, the prosecutor, defense counsel, police, and all interested community members. Within the circle, people can speak from the heart in a shared search for understanding of the event, and together identify the steps necessary to assist in healing all affected parties and prevent future crimes. Sentencing circles typically involve a multi-step procedure that includes 1, application by the offender to participate in the circle process. 2, a healing circle for the victim. 3, a healing circle for the offender. 4, a sentencing circle to develop consensus on the elements of a sentencing plan. And 5, follow-up circles to monitor the progress of the offender. The sentencing plan may incorporate commitments by the system, community, and family members, as well as by the offender. Sentencing circles are used for adult and juvenile offenders with a variety of offenses and have been used in both rural and urban settings. Specifics of the circle process vary from community to community and are designed locally to fit community needs and culture. On top of that, I want to highly encourage all members of the House. A good friend of mine produced a short documentary on this particular issue. You can go on YouTube and find it just by typing in sentencing circles, and you can actually see the Edmonton Police Service member that actually participated in one of these sentencing circles, what they thought about it, what their prejudices were before going into the sentencing circle process, and then of course what they thought about it once they finished the actual process. And again, I will reiterate that this is the type of these kinds of programs I wish we as a government, or the government and we as a legislature, were focusing on to actually bring real solutions to real problems, and in this case, the real problem being the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the prison system. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my chair. Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to the bill? Seeing none, I'm prepared to ask the question. For third reading of Bill 9, the Public's Right to Know Act, from the Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. All those in favour of third reading, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The ayes have it. So moved. It's carried, and motion is carried.
Bill 9, Public's Right to Know Act, is now read a third time. Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 12, Trustee Act. Adjourned debate, Mr. Nielsen.
Looking for members wishing to speak to Bill 12, the Trustees Act. I see the Honourable Member from Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to provide some comments here at second reading of Bill 12, the Trustee Act. This is quite a lengthy piece of legislation. It's quite complicated as well, and so it is for that reason that I am very grateful for the detailed and very careful work of the Alberta Law Reform Institute. These folks do something of a yeoman's task of combing through old pieces of legislation that it is identified by various members of the legal profession that require update and make recommendations to government on how to do so after a lengthy and detailed, typically, consultation process with members of the legal profession, and provide that analysis in both a practical way based on how those pieces of legislation have worked or not worked, and also an analysis that is oftentimes interjurisdictional in nature, and that references some of the academic reckoning in various law faculties with these types of pieces of legislation. Now, a trust is, of course, a fiduciary responsibility relationship between an individual and one or more persons to hold property and to use and make decisions about that property for the beneficiaries of that trust. Many different types of trusts, and some of our legislation was very old, and this was the case across the country. And indeed, there is an entity called the Uniform Law Conference of Canada, which undertook a project on trustee legislation reform across the country. And they made a recommendation at the time in 2012 that the Uniform Trustee Act be adopted in Alberta, but the Alberta Law Reform Institute then examined those recommendations and indicated that there were a few aspects of that work that needed to be tailored and clarified for Alberta's particular needs. Understanding, as we do, all of the areas of provincial jurisdiction around property that this law reform project would affect. I want to pause for a moment here and reflect on the value of organizations like the Alberta Law Reform Institute. There is a reason why they are so well respected within the legal profession and why they merit public support as well. These are the types of what I like to call drumbeat of governing processes that are tremendously time-consuming, do not result in, lightning in the sky and people's typical understandings of what we do here in legislatures, but they are nonetheless extremely important to the maintenance of rule of law, to the equal application of the law to all individuals, to ordinary concepts of fairness that any ordinary person can understand and accept, the appropriate continuation of the business of our courts, such that we do not have legislation that is antiquated or difficult to interpret or resulting in varying interpretations that then result in appeals after appeals or other inconsistencies or outcomes that in fact disadvantage certain groups. This is the kind of work that, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, is quite boring in nature. And certainly when I read through the Trustees Act at first, given as I have some background in law courses but not having gone to law school, the Trustee Act was certainly one that, reading it through, made my eyes glaze over, and I had to go and read the Alberta Law Reform Institute paper that they subsequently put out a couple of years back to understand exactly what we were talking about here. And I think that's normal even for people in the legal profession. If you don't have an expertise in these particular areas of law, the eyes may also glaze over with respect to this piece, which is why we need those experts to inform the debate through, like I said, the practical use and application of these legal frameworks, but also the work of legal academics and scholars. And the Alberta Law Reform Institute contains both of those types of people. That's how you get the best evidence-based decision-making. That is how a government that is interested in the best outcomes for public policy conducts itself. And we would do well to revisit some of those anchors and guardrails of not only the Westminster parliamentary system, but also of a properly functioning liberal democracy. That yes, we are assembled in here a group of ordinary people. Some of us are lawyers and some of us are not. Some of us have different backgrounds. But the fact of the matter is we must trust and respond to appropriate expertise and evidence, and not shout it out of the room because it does not automatically confirm our priors, especially if our priors happen to be a predilection for serving particular groups of folks who are not interested in evidence, scientific method, or the rule of law. Now, in terms of what this bill actually does, there have been amendments to the Trustees Act, but it's never been comprehensively reviewed. It's largely based on an 1893 English statute. Now, that, on the face of it, makes the case for why it might need to be updated. Our property relationships to one another are quite different, even prior to the Charter. certainly division of property, holding of property was a matter that between men and women, for example, or on the basis of national or ethnic origin was something that was already beginning to change prior to the Charter. And of course, we have seen a number of changes in this regard after the Charter. And so that in and of itself would signal that the Trustees Act may have some inconsistencies or some places where it cross threads with established practice around making decisions to protect and benefit others in terms of the beneficiaries. This piece of legislation establishes more provisions for the day-to-day management of trusts. And certainly that is a piece that is very, very important to the public interest when we examine who, in fact, becomes someone who has their property managed in a trust relationship. The fact of the matter is that there are newer types of trusts, for example, for folks with disabilities, trusts that manage inheritances or significant financial gifts while receiving age. And for example, our government passed legislation in 2018 to make this possible, the Henson Trust legislation, which, if memory serves, was repealed in some sort of ridiculous omnibus exercise undertaken by this current government. I suppose that's another thing that we'll have to fix, because the fact of the matter is that an appropriate and appropriately respectful way to approach trusts for people receiving age benefits is something that is most certainly in the public interest, and it defies logic why that would have been something that was repealed. I'm happy to be corrected that it wasn't, but I think it was. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I mean, just it makes absolutely no sense why anyone would do that, but that is the situation that we're in. The history of this particular conversation around trusts, of course, resulted in the Alberta Law Reform Institute publishing a discussion paper. There were consultations, as I indicated. There were 23 new or modified recommendations. It appears that the province, the Executive Council, has included many of those recommendations in this legislation. That is a good thing. I certainly support this piece of legislation's expeditious passage through this legislature. I will say, however, that there's no question that both this bill and Bill 9, that we just spoke to, Bill 9, I spoke to just yesterday around second reading, and then we just finished with third. This Bill 12 has moved into this stage, this current stage of debate rather quickly as well. There's no question that other pieces of legislation could move at a similar pace. Certainly if the government didn't see fit to adjourn debate on what is their so-called priorities. There's no question that the Minister of Justice and Solicitor General has a number of important files to balance, this being one of them. And there's no question that some pieces of legislation move quicker through this House than others. But, you know, along with this and Bill 9, if the Minister was at all worried about the effect on folks who are managed, for example, via folks' affairs who are managed via the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee, then there would have been some reckoning with the challenges that the OPGT has had within this bill. And there is not. For example, when there are victims of crime who are also folks whose affairs are managed by the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. Those folks sometimes were former children in care, and their affairs are still managed by the OPGT as adults. What they can qualify for when they are a victim of crime, it's the OPGT that goes and gets them whatever they're entitled to. For example, if they, it's the government of Alberta, it's the province that acts on their behalf because they are, in fact, their affairs are under trustee of the government. So if they're a victim of a crime or even a victim of a car accident, a civil litigation affair, but certainly if they're a victim of a crime, it would be the OPGT that goes and tries to get those folks whatever they need. They don't have parents or anyone else to advocate for them. It's our job. By our, I mean with a capital O. It's the province's job to meet those folks' needs. And what has happened since the raiding of the Victims of Crime Fund is that those folks don't get anything if under the care of the province they somehow experienced an egregious crime, such as sexual assault or aggravated assault. They don't get anything anymore. I think there's 5 counseling sessions or something, like, come on, give me a break. So some of that could have been contained, some of the challenges for folks whose affairs are managed by the provincial trustee relationship could have potentially been at some point in this legislature. The problems with the Victims of Crime Fund could have been appropriately reckoned with given that the legislation changing. It was introduced in June of 2020. There was supposed to be some sort of review which around what victims of crime are actually getting. Never happened.
Any other members wishing to speak to Bill 12, second reading? I see the honourable member from Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and offer a few brief comments on Bill 12, the Trustee Act. And I want to first of all, thank all of my colleagues ahead of me for speaking. Again, I think it's worth highlighting some of the comments that my friend from Lethbridge West made in regards to this bill. That we're happy to see that in this particular case, the government has has consulted with academic and legal experts and adopted a number of the recommendations that have come forward from those people who have looked closely at this issue of trusts and made significant recommendations for reform. And certainly, I would encourage the government to take that approach to a whole host of public policy decisions and not just making it up as they go, as they seem to have done on a number of other important files. I can't help but wonder what the state of the Eastern Slopes would have been if the government had just conducted this kind of public policy review at the very outset of its term, instead of scrapping the Lougheed coal policy, and then continually walking back that decision and finding some kind of cobbled together way of appearing to be responding to the massive backlash that it suffered, while also still intent on catering to the big coal interests that this government is clearly favors over the interests of average landowners. And it's incredibly concerning to me, Mr. Speaker, that the Coal Policy Committee that the government struck made a number of recommendations to the Energy Minister that she has been completely silent on. A whole host of recommendations that the government refuses to even acknowledge were made in that report, much less address other areas of public policy. So had the government taken the approach that they've taken with this Bill 12 to other issues like the coal policy issue, I think Albertans would be in a place would be in a much better place. The Eastern Slopes would have their future much more secure, and this government wouldn't find itself with such a severe trust deficit as it does now. You know, on the issue of trust itself, I first of all want to declare that I have absolutely no conflict of interest whatsoever with this piece of legislation, just by virtue of the fact that I have nothing to leave behind when I die. Mr. Speaker, as soon as I expire, the only thing that I will leave to my dependents will be a bill for the cost of cremating and disposing of my remains. I have no earthly possessions, nothing of value. In fact, the only inheritance, I think, might be the gas that they will be able to siphon out of the van and perhaps put into their own vehicles. That's it. So, sorry, kids. You better keep your old man around for a lot longer, because this is as good as it's going to get. There's nothing that I'm going to leave behind. So having declared absolutely no conflict of interest, I'm pleased to offer some other comments on this piece of legislation, and I do want to pick up on something that again my friend from Lethbridge West raised in her remarks on this issue, and that was the issue of Henson trusts, because I had a number of people come into my constituency office from the period of 2015 to 2018, when our government had been elected, and before we took issue to allow for the creation of these so-called Henson trusts. There were a number of families in Gold Bar who had dependents who were receiving AISH and wanted to be able to leave behind a little bit of an inheritance, but were afraid to do so because that would mean that their AISH benefits would be clawed back. Now, I know that to members of the UCP, clawing back AISH benefits isn't a severe concern, but to the families of people who are recipients of AISH, clawing back AISH benefits is a concern. And these families were put in a tremendously awkward circumstance, because they wanted to be able to provide for their dependents who were not able to provide for themselves, and yet by doing so they would actually make their dependents worse off than if they had left them nothing. And that struck them as being incredibly unfair. And that struck us as being incredibly unfair too. And so that's why we took the opportunity to amend the legislation to allow for the creation of these Henson trusts, so that families of AISH recipients could leave behind a small inheritance for their loved ones who were recipients of AISH without putting them at risk of losing their benefits. And I think that was an important public policy decision that left the people, that left the families with their minds at ease that their loved ones would be taken care of once they passed away. And it also, provided for a suitable public policy position, I think, for the people of Alberta, one that the people of Alberta were happy with. I think everybody thought that was a reasonable state of affairs. Everyone, I guess, except this current government, which decided in one of its pieces of omnibus legislation to repeal this concept of Henson trusts and again leave the families of AISH recipients uncertain about the future of their loved ones once they passed away, and that's extremely unfortunate. But saying that, I think that that overall this piece of legislation is a much-needed update to the legal framework around establishing trustees. As I said at the very beginning, I'm very pleased to see that the government relied heavily on the advice of experts like the Alberta Law Reform Institute when it decided to bring forward these changes. It is a little bit concerning to me, Mr. Speaker, that the Act only implements about 80 of the 90 or so recommendations that the Alberta Law Reform Institute made to the government on this particular issue, and I'm curious to know why those outstanding recommendations weren't adopted in this piece of legislation. Is it that the government needed more time to work through the implications of those recommendations and that they intend to bring forward legislation at a future date to address them? Did they reject them out of hand for reasons that are unknown to us? Or did they simply, I don't know, get bored with the issue and couldn't go beyond 80 recommendations because at that point it was probably whiskey o'clock on the Sky Palace Terrace, and they couldn't be bothered to complete their work anymore. I don't know. And it would be interesting to hear from the Minister of Justice or any other member of Executive Council why the government refused to address these outstanding recommendations. But on balance, I think that this is overall a significant step forward in the legal framework around trusts and trustees. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to join my colleagues here in the official opposition in supporting this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to join debate? I do see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time on the Bill 12, the Trustee Act. And as with a number of the bills lately, I have certainly found some things to be very positive about and wish to support. I think that's a particularly important area for us to be moving forward on, because as we know, the original Trustee Act was based on legislation that is literally over 100 years old, and it's really time to bring it home to this legislature to take responsibility for it within the context of this province, and to ensure that the Trustee Act and all the recommendations that have been brought forward is put together in such a way that it benefits the people in the province of Alberta. And so I'm glad to see that the process by which we have arrived at this date has been one which I think we all can celebrate here in this province, and that is those people who are most informed about the topic were brought together and had an opportunity to put together a review of the issues that are inherent in the area of trusts, which of course included not only members of the Law Society, but also some members of the public who experienced some of the significant consequences of when things go wrong in the situation of trustee positions. And so I'm very glad to see that the report that came out in January of 2017 called A New Trustee Act for Alberta, final report of the Law Commission Society, was largely adopted here in this particular piece of legislation. Because what we have is exactly what we like to see here in the legislature, and that is people bringing forward recommendations based on their vast lived experience, their academic knowledge, and their legal expertise, and bringing forward recommendations that are about doing some of the mundane things that most of us don't even know that much about. and people that have the ability to understand the small detailed work that has to go into establishing a law such that it will be, people will be able to practice it well without too much lack of clarity in the future. I know you can never make things 100% clear, but having this great group of people put together a good list of recommendations and then have the government adopt most of those recommendations is good. Of course, over time, we'll spend some time making sure that the recommendations that have not been adopted by the government are re-examined just to make sure that maybe they shouldn't be included into this bill. Just to follow up on terms of government decision making, but the adoption of the majority of these recommendations are good. And starting, of course, with the adoption of the Uniform Trustee Act, I think is a good starting place. This is certainly an act that we can be supportive of, because we know that the place from which it has been derived has been one that has been, nonpartisan. It's been focused on the law. It's been focused on the outcome of the people that will experience it. I noticed that the standards of which are being put in here in all of the different sections. There are sections on who is appointed as trustees, when the trustee resigns, when there's a transfer of trustees, all of those pieces, which are the minutiae of this type of law, have all been set down on the underlying priority that we only seek to reach the highest possible standard of skill and professionalism amongst our trustees. And I think that's an excellent place to begin. And it allows, of course, courts to make very clear decisions as about whether or not the decisions made by trustees on behalf of others have in fact met those high standards, because the standards are clearly laid out, which is something we've been asking this government to do in a number of other acts. Can you please lay out what the standards are? Can you please lay out what it means for you when you say you're going to produce a report, for example? In the last bill we just talked about, there's on the public's right to know, there is the overarching legal structure that says a report will be produced, but then it does not say what's in the report. And so it's really that lack of detail that brought us to great concern in Bill 9. And so now it's nice to see in Bill 12 that we actually have a little bit more detail, that more is being provided to people who are involved in the trustee relationship, and therefore it's providing some clarity to the court system. And I understand that the government is hopeful that this actually means that we'll have a reduction in the number of cases that go to court and end up in conflict, or that if they do go to court, they're much more quickly settled because the rules are established in such a way that they will there will be clarity as to whether or not the rules were followed fairly quickly. And I know that right now the courts in Alberta are in a very difficult position. We do not have the number of appointed judges that we might have had if the government had submitted the list of needs to the federal government, as had been requested and was not fulfilled by this government. So we are short in the number of judges. We have court prosecutors threatening to strike because of the difficulties in the court system. And overall, there's just been it's been a very problematic few years under the UCP government and the court system. So it's nice to see that we actually have something coming forward that's going to benefit the court system and help to take some of the pressure off. And therefore, I certainly want to support it. I'm also very encouraged to see that there is a continuation of the current prudent investor rule that ensures that investors cannot take wild chances with the monies invested in their trusts, that they must always act in a prudent way that is for the best interest of the person who is the recipient of the trust. Now, we know the government has had problem with that in the past as well, under AIMCO when they lost $1 billion because they decided to experiment with very high-risk investments and lost a significant amount of money for the province of Alberta under the UCP government. So in this case, I'm very happy to see that there is a prudent investor rule, one which I think government should always kind of maintain as they move forward, because I think it's important that people who are responsible for the financial well-being of others be in a place where they have to understand that they cannot just assume any kind of possible consequence for their behavior, because it's not them that will have to bear those consequences. And so that prudent investment is a rule that I'm very happy to see in this list, and wish, of course, that the government would exercise it themselves in terms of their own investment rule behavior. I also want to spend a few moments on the concern we have regarding Henson trusts. Having been a social worker for much of my career, I certainly have worked with a significant number of people who have had a need for a trust from their family because of their inability to care for their own financial needs. In my career, I did spend time working in child welfare, of course, and where we had some people who were unable to take care of themselves. I also worked at the Glenrose Hospital in the area of people with disabilities and so on. And so I have seen circumstances where we have individuals, because of no fault of their own sometimes. For example, when I was at the Glenrose Hospital, people had acquired brain injuries or were born with disabilities, some congenital factor which prevented them from being able to take on responsibility for their own well-being. And I know that all of these people generally are taken care of well by their families and, of course, by many public institutions in the time that they are, from the time they are born till they are 18. But then what happens is at the age of 18, a lot of that responsibility suddenly shifts to public institutions like the Office of the Public Guardian. And of course, the actual source of income for these individuals shifts to the program which we refer to as AISH, Assistance for the Severely Handicapped. Unfortunately, this government has made a number of decisions with regard to people living on AISH which are problematic. They have failed to raise the rates as inflation goes up. They've de-indexed them. They have delayed the payment, the AISH payments for 3 days at the end of every month, which makes it very difficult to pay your bills on time. And of course, they did all of this just to make their budget look slightly more balanced at an earlier time. No real function either for government or for the people involved. It was just simply a self-preservation act on the part of this government. So it was very discouraging then to see them pile on to the people who live on age, people who have the inability to care for their own needs. This issue of removing the Henson Trust during an omnibus bill, in which they just slid this in amongst many other things. And the purpose of the Henson Trust was really quite clear, and that was for families to participate in the well-being of their family members beyond their own life. And now many of us choose to do that. Many of us have spent a great deal of time ensuring our finances are in order so that we can pass on the benefits of our successes in our lives to our own children. And this should be equally true of people who have children with disabilities. In the case, in my own case, for example, if I were to die in the next little while, all of that which I own will be passed on to my children, and it would not be subtracted from their income. They would be able to receive those monies. In fact, I could even right now provide significant amounts of money to my children as a gift, and it would not even be taxable at this time. But unfortunately, if you're on AISH, all of that goes out the window. You receive gifts from your own parents, it suddenly comes off your income. If your parents have put money aside in order to be able to provide you with resources for the rest of your life, and through a Henson Trust, that would have been protected if the legislation had been left alone, but this government chose to remove that, and as a result, now if you set money aside for your children, that money is taken off their income. Which essentially means that if you have been a responsible and caring parent, and you've set money aside for your children, that you essentially are saving money for the government. You're not saving money for your children. You're not providing them with the ability to do things. Having worked with many disabled people in my career as a social worker, I know that their life is not a rich life. They do not have, in terms of finances, they do not have the wealth to do things they want to do. I remember one young man I worked with at Camp Hihoha, where I worked for 3 summers, put myself through university, by the name of Ricky. I ran into him on Jasper Avenue one day, asked what he was doing, and he said he just sits on Jasper Avenue with his coffee cup there on the end of his wheelchair. He cannot speak very well, so it's a elongated conversation. And people put money into his little cup. He doesn't even ask for it, but his disability is so obvious that people come along and put money into his cup. And I said, oh, well, what do you plan to do with that? And he said, I'm going to buy myself something to play music with. He had to go out onto the street to ask other Albertans to contribute to his life just so he could listen to some music, which is one of the few pleasures that he had available to him because his disability was such that he could not feed himself, for example. He could only move around in an electric wheelchair because he did have enough control to be able to manipulate the chair itself. And I just thought, living on AISH, which is what he was living on, is not a very nice situation to be in. By the time you pay your basic rent and the extra costs of your disability, often things like wheelchairs and other kinds of things you might need, or lifts in the toilet and other things like that, you really have no money. So that he was actually in the position of having to sit on the corner of Jasper Avenue, collect money so that he could buy himself a small stereo of some nature. And we just thought it was really important when we were in government to have a hints and trust that would prevent that kind of thing from happening, and now this government has taken it away.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other members looking to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll keep my comments very, very brief. I think, as you can see, that our caucus has concurred that this bill is necessary and provides good function and improved function for trusts here in the province of Alberta. And I certainly just want to reiterate how it reflects positively on how a bill should be researched and solicited and consulted with the people who actually use that law. And so this being a reflection of the Law Reform Institute's consultations, as well as a reflection of the Uniform Law Conference of Canada, right, from a number of years back, it seems to hold up very well, not just as legislation for the province, but as part of having some concurrence with other forms of trust law in other jurisdictions across the country. And so, based on all of those things, I think that we can certainly support this bill, and I appreciate the Minister and his department for doing the work to get it done.
Thank you. Are there any others wishing to join debate? Seeing none, I am prepared to ask the question. I know. Yeah, no. And I have noted that there is an opportunity to close debate, which has been waived. So, the Honourable Member for Calgary Cross has moved second reading of Bill 12, Trustee Act, on behalf of the Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for second reading? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried and so ordered. I see the Honourable Member for Lethbridge East is risen.
Bill 12, Trustee Act, is now read a second time.
Quick for us. Lethbridge East.
Thank you. I move the assembly be adjourned until 1:30 p.m.
Heard the motion as proposed by the honourable member for Lethbridge East to adjourn until 1:30 p.m. today. All those in favour, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. Carried and so ordered.